Good morning. Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud lighted incense, pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great vow, Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastamaprana Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. I forgot to put on my rock suit. Won't make you say the chant with me since I didn't put on there that we were going to do that. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me on a Sunday morning. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the idea of interdependency, interconnectedness, that sort of thing. And what gave me the idea about talking about that today is that we're going to be doing a thing at Stetson this week. We do these programs, I've talked about this before, called Big Words. And we take a theme of sort of universal or near universal spiritual significance. It's usually a little word with big meaning, right? So we're going to start off the school year with big words, mask. And so I've been thinking about kind of the wearing of masks and everything for the last few weeks since we decided we're going to do this. And the concept of interdependency keeps coming up. So let me just kind of start off with a little story. There's a sutra called the Flower Garland Sutra, which is an important Mahayana sutra. It's vast. Most people don't read the whole thing. There's a few. It's kind of like the Lotus Sutra, where there's a few chapters that contain the important teachings. And there's one where it talks about Indra's net. So some of you will have heard of Indra's net before, I'm sure. And the idea is Indra, in Indian cosmology, Indian mythology, and so on, Indra is the king of the gods. And so Indra decided that he wanted to have a really pretty focal point for Mount Sumeru, the place where all the gods lived. And so he asked the divine architect to come visit him at the palace. And he said, I want you to create something that will inspire awe in everyone. And so the architect left for a while, and then he came back and he brought this net with him. So, and the net, and mounted it over the palace in the way that it's expanded out infinitely in all directions. And at each node of the net, each place where the strands of the net came together, he mounted a jewel, a diamond-like jewel with many facets. And so each jewel not only sparkled on its own, but it reflected the sparkle of all the other jewels in the net. And so since the net extended infinitely in all directions, there were an infinite number of jewels, and each jewel was reflecting the other infinite number of jewels who were in turn reflecting, and so on. So it was infinity times infinity times infinity. Something the mind can't comprehend, obviously. But the idea being that everything in the universe reflects everything else in the universe, right? So this idea that everything reflects, contains, is interdependent with, interwoven with everything else is a very key concept in Mahayana Buddhism, especially. You know, if you think about Indra's net, if you take one jewel and you pluck it, right, the entire web vibrates. That's how closely intertwined everything in the universe is. If you change one thing, everything changes. So this is why it's important in Mahayana Buddhism, well, this is an explanation of why, I guess, that it's important in Mahayana Buddhism for our practice to be for the benefit of all beings. So if I practice and calm my mind, and I do this with the understanding that what I do affects other beings, then everyone benefits from that. If I practice selfishly, I might affect everyone in some negative way. And so this is the importance of kind of being aware of this interdependency, is that if we know that what we do affects all other beings, and we keep that in mind as we live our lives, then we're more likely to affect all other beings in positive ways. And so in a sense, even if we're taking, I can see that I'm kind of silhouetted. I'm going to put on a little extra light here. Does that help? Hopefully that helps. Looks better to me. I hope it looks better to you too. If we do this, then we can recognize that if we watch out for ourselves with the understanding that we are at the same time watching out for others, and if we watch out for others at the same time with the understanding that in doing so we're watching out for ourselves, then we're likely to have a better, more focused spiritual practice. And so this actually there's a teaching that I've talked about before. It's from the Pali Canon. The Buddha is watching talks about some bamboo acrobats. I think that's the term that's normally used. So basically in India, even back in the Buddha's day, there were these acrobats that would balance a bamboo pole, and they would climb up the pole and they would balance at the top, and they would do tricks, headstands and handstands and stuff. And sometimes they work together as a team. So I started to say, I wouldn't do this. I don't think I'd ever be able to develop that capacity. But a bamboo acrobat would climb up the pole and get to the top and balance up there, and then his assistant would climb up the pole and then climb up him and maybe balance on top of his head or balance on his shoulders and so on. And so the Buddha was talking about this pair of bamboo acrobats that were working this way. And so the assistant climbs up and gets on top of the master's shoulders on top of the bamboo pole. And the master calls up and says, all right, so you look after yourself and I'll look after myself, and we'll be okay. And we'll do our tricks, and then we'll climb down and collect our tips from the audience, and everything will be good. And the assistant goes, no, that doesn't seem right to me. I'll look after you and you look after me. And in doing that, then we'll be able to do our tricks, and we'll climb down the pole and collect our tips and be on our way. And the Buddha says they're both right. Each needs to look after him or herself, and they need to look after each other. And in looking after myself, I look after you, and looking after you, I look after me. And so if we have that awareness, that mindfulness, then we accomplish what we set out to do. So this is a really kind of a good approach to spiritual practice, but it's kind of a good approach toward life in general. And a lot of what we do in Buddhism and a lot of what happens in religion really kind of has this two-way action. So think about the principle of compassion and compassionate living in Buddhism. There's this kind of two things that are kind of at the core of Buddhist practice when it comes to living in the world. And one is the idea of charity, of giving, generosity. And the other idea is moral restraint, living in a way that where we refrain from causing harm. And they interrelate with one another either. If I'm giving, then hopefully I'm contributing to your well-being, and you'll be less susceptible to harm. And at the same time, if I'm refraining from doing the things that we refrain from doing in the precepts, refrain from killing, stealing, engaging in harmful speech, engaging in harmful sexual activity, engaging in intoxicants that can cause us to lose our awareness of what we're doing, then we're not just restraining our own actions, but we're giving the gift of freedom from our potential causing of harm. Right? If I could yell at you and I don't, right? You talk about wrong speech. Then I've given you freedom from my animosity, or from the expression of my animosity. I might still be mad at you, right? But at least I haven't inflicted that upon you. So part of our practice then is to understand this, and to understand how giving and restraint are related to one another. But then there's the other side of this, which is in giving you freedom from my harm and in restraining my own mind, I'm also improving my own spiritual life. So I'm going to be less likely to be in situations that would be difficult and stressful for me too. And I develop my mind in a way that makes my mind more resilient and less likely to become upset. So precepts and dana are two sides of the same coin. And being charitable to others and being restrained toward others, and training my own mind and my own heart, my own life, are also two sides of the same coin. It's very interesting the way that works, I think. So, one of the ways that we express that is through bowing, right? So a lot of Americans don't like bowing. It's culturally kind of foreign to us. It's sort of interesting right now with the COVID that we're kind of encouraged to gasho to each other instead of shaking hands. Handshaking really kind of came out from this idea, I guess, from the feudal system, or maybe even before that. I don't know, but the idea that if I can clasp your hand, number one, I'm acknowledging that we're together, and number two, I can't hold your hand if I've got a sword in it, right? So handshaking is acknowledgement of oneness and of non-harming. And Dagasho is kind of the same thing. I'm acknowledging that my heart and your heart are kind of connected, and I'm acknowledging my respect to you. So if you respect someone, you don't harm them, right? Because you want them to do well. You acknowledge their importance in the world. And so when I respect you, then I'm visibly, ritually expressing that wish to not harm. So there's an interesting thing in one of the patriarchs of Zen, was talking about respect and respect for teachers. And I can't remember the story exactly. I should have looked this up, but I didn't think about it. It just now occurred to me that there's this whole thing when you become enlightened, everything is enlightened, right? So you don't just bow to your teacher, you bow to the trees and rocks and clouds. You see everything is enlightened. When you enlighten your own mind, you live in an enlightened world, right? So this is another example of this sort of interdependency. And this one master achieves mastery, becomes the Zen master and is recognized, and then says he's going to leave the monastery. And they say, well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to go, continue to find teachings. He said, if I meet a 7-year-old girl that has the Dharma, I'll bow to her and ask for a teaching, right? So we think of bowing as something where, we bow to something greater than ourselves, but really bowing can be a matter of acknowledging that we are a part of something that transcends what we consider to be us. So, a lot of times, think about masks. I said this whole idea came up as a result of wearing masks. And, putting on robes is an act of respect, not of respect to me. It's an act of respect to you, right? It's the point where I acknowledge that I am in service of the Dharma and I'm in service of all beings. It's interesting when I ordained in Soto Zen, the Jem Ginjo said something about when we were talking about my ordination. This was before I ordained, and he asked me, well, why do you want to do this? And we had a conversation about this, and he said something about how we see this as entering service to the community. It's interesting the choice of words that we have religious services. And you could see this as the priests, the monks, the ministers, or whatever, coming in to do service for the congregation. You usually kind of see it as we're leaders, but we're really servants, right? Servants of the Dharma and servants to the community as well. But when I noticed when I ordained the first time in the Thai order, you have this idea, I'm going to become a monk. That's going to be a big deal. And, you're worried what's going to happen and how hard it's going to be and all of this kind of stuff, because it is at that kind of level and in that sort of setting where you're taking 227 precepts and you're not allowed to eat after noon and all this kind of stuff. This is a bit of a physical challenge. But what was really interesting was when I put on the robes and then I walked out of the temple and walking in front of people who had been there to see my ordination or people who were just coming to visit the temple, and all of a sudden I'm a monk. And it was a really interesting feeling. It's like I had changed. Obviously physically I had, and I still was the same height, still was the same weight, still, had the same abilities and difficulties and all that kind of stuff. But putting on this robe transformed me into a servant of the Dharma, right? And it sort of brought me into the Sangha at that point. Changes your role in life. So putting on a mask can have very interesting religious connotations and spiritual connotations. And so we see people wearing masks now, and I'm sure most of them just see it as an inconvenience. But think about where the idea of wearing a mask comes from historically. And wearing a mask generally was either to conceal, you could see it as to conceal your identity, but it was really to take on a different identity. If you look at like primitive religion and wearing of masks and rituals and dances and stuff like that, somewhat obvious, but think about in like Tantric Buddhism, in some schools of Tantric Buddhism, there are these practices that involve putting on masks of like the protector deities, when we do the opening bows, it's the Dharma protector Buddha, Dharma protector bodhisattvas, there are these beings that protect the Dharma, that protect the worshipers and so on, and beings that are in a sense divine. They're reflective of what Buddhism sees as divine states. And not divinity in the sense of being, up there in the clouds somewhere, but divinity in the sense of reflecting those higher purposes of human existence, which are connected to this sense of interdependency. Things that we do for the whole web, not just for this little jewel right here, but for the whole web, right? And recognizing that what we do is reflected everywhere. That's what I say when I say divine. So metta bhavana, when you get to the point where we say, may all beings be happy. I mean, that's something that, I'm doing sitting here on my cushion in the floor in the morning, right? And I'm doing it because it helps my concentration and all of that, but also recognizing that action connects me to that whole web of interdependency in a really profound way. So when you put on the mask in these tantric rituals, you are taking on the face of the divine. And so you really are transcending your form in order to take on the form of the divine. It's temporary. You take off the mask, you go back to being the schmuck over here, right? But for that period of time, you are embodying that divine principle. There's another use of wearing masks. And I'm not going to go into the whole wearing veils for modesty reasons and stuff like that, because I don't really have much expertise in that area. But there's in the principle of non-harming, as reflected in some Indian religions like Jainism, there's an order of Jain monks who wear masks that look a whole lot like COVID masks. I wish I had left mine out in the other room. I'd put it on and show you. But they wear these masks that conceal their nose and mouth. The reason is to keep from inhaling small organisms like gnats and stuff like that, because they make this very firm commitment, as much as possible, to refraining from harming any being, even a little gnat or a mosquito that might be inhaled while they're going about their business, or even microorganisms that you can't see that would be harmed by your inhaling them. And so they wear these masks. And so the mask is, again, a symbol of your commitment to not cause harm. I think that's kind of interesting in the, if you look at the current situation and people wearing masks in order to prevent harmful things from coming out of you and being inhaled by someone else, or ending up on a surface that somebody might pick up and transfer when they rub their eyes or whatever. But it's the same kind of principle. I'm wearing this mask to prevent my causing harm to another being. So people who are having issues with this from a religious freedom perspective or whatever, or just from the idea of, government telling you have to wear a mask and you resent that, think about it as as a spiritual practice. Okay, I'm going to be uncomfortable for a little while because I'm going to have this mask on. But in the process, I can be practicing non-harming. As part of preparing for this event tomorrow night at Stetson, which is going to be virtual, by the way, but you can't come unless you're a Stetson student. I listened to the recording of the special meeting they did in the city, because I'd heard that there were people who were objecting to this. The special meeting was, should the city enact a mask mandate? And the result was that they did. But there have been a number of people who showed up to argue. And so I listened to like 2 hours of people saying why they didn't want to have to wear masks. And there were some kind of scriptural things. There was somebody who said uh, about three people that quoted various scriptures saying that they shouldn't have to do that. The scriptures they quoted really didn't have anything to do with masks, at least not that I could figure out. I'm not an expert in that particular tradition by any means, but there's things that say don't hide your faith away, don't hide your faith behind a mask, and I think that's good. I think you should be open in your spiritual expression. Now, for me, that would mean that to be open in my spiritual expression, I would put on a mask when I go to the grocery store, right? Because my spirituality says don't harm others if you can avoid it. And so the mindful thing to do would be to put on a mask, right? Um, but so I suppose there would be, if you felt like you needed to, like showing your face was a show of faith somehow, I suppose you could find other ways to show your righteousness, your devotion. I think that would be constructive. There may be there's plenty of ways that you can show how committed you are to your spiritual practice without putting other people in harm. In fact, if you're putting other people in harm, I can't think of any religion that actually encourages that. So, one thing I saw in that recording of that meeting, a lot of people talking about their personal freedom being compromised by having to wear a mask. And I was thinking about that. I have never been a big proponent of arbitrary government interference in our lives. In fact, I'm gonna say something now that I rarely say out loud. I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but the first time I registered to vote, I registered as a libertarian. Now, at the time, libertarianism was very much associated with like the anti-war movement and things like that, because there were drafted people, and so it was about not drafting and treating drugs as health issues rather than law enforcement issues, and try to do away with the idea of victimless crimes and stuff. I probably wouldn't have, if I had a conversation with my 18-year-old self right now, we probably would not agree on a lot of things. But at any rate, I did register that way, and then I worked for a guy who was actually involved in a campaign of someone who was running for president that I actually felt very highly of. And I came back and said I'd registered to vote. He said, would you register as a Republican or a Democrat? And I said, well, I registered as a libertarian. He goes, you idiot. You can't vote in the primary. Oh. And so that weekend I went back and changed my registration to I'll admit it, I'm a Democrat. I think most of you know that. And have been ever since. Because I thought, well, I'd like to be able to vote in primaries. He goes, you can still vote for the Libertarian if you want to. But anyway, as I said, I would probably disagree with a lot of my views from back then, but I still don't think, I'm not a big believer in rules for rules' sake. I think there need to be a reason for them, right? But we do a lot of things that we don't want to do, that aren't particularly convenient, that we do to benefit others. Refraining from gossip. It's one of those things. It's real hard to do. It's inconvenient, but we try to do it in order to prevent harming others. And certainly I've had the urge to punch people in the nose and not done it because, again, we know better. We have our impulses, and then we have our higher judgment that says, no, I'm going to hold myself to a higher standard than just those impulses that arise. So, things like, you see people, when they started making seatbelts mandatory, people got really upset about that. For a long time, I didn't like wearing seatbelts either. And then I had a kid. All of a sudden, seatbelts were important because I'd want him to wear seatbelts when he got in the car. So therefore, I'm going to wear a seatbelt, right? Plus, my life suddenly became important not just to me and to, his mom and my mom and people who liked me, but really I was taking care of somebody else, who was highly dependent on me. So there was that much more of a reason for me to protect myself. So I could kind of see those saying, hey, if I want to get a classic car and I don't want to muck it up with seat belts, I should be able to ride my 32 Ford to the beach without having to worry about seat belts. I could see the argument. I wouldn't agree with it, but I could understand the argument. But when you get to the point where you go, okay, I need to do something that will protect others, it's very difficult to find a reason to argue that on the basis of personal freedom. And life is very much like, if you think about it, man, this is really a fragile thing we have. And it's really something that we should be very grateful for, to have this time between the time this 5 aggregates comes into being and the time it's no longer useful or no longer held together by its karma and falls apart. We have this, most people, less than 100 years that we get to spend this way, and it's very fragile. It's like balancing on top of a bamboo pole, really, when you think about it. In the grand scheme of time, beginningless time and eternity, we have this little narrow pole that we get to dance on top of, right? So it's important as we're doing this dance to look out for ourselves and to look out for others. And if we can do that, then we get to really make something out of this moment that we get to balance on top of this pole, do our tricks, whatever we're going to do, and collect our reward. So that's really all I really wanted to talk about today. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. So I can, I'm using my laptop. Got a new laptop. It's going to be cool. This is only the second time I've used it for something like this. The first time was for Zoom calls, and it worked pretty well when I was sitting at my desk. And I thought I would try it this way, a little farther from me, so you could get the altar. But I can move a little closer. If you got any questions or comments that you'd like for me to respond to, go ahead and write them now, and I can come up and read them and answer. Well, I don't see anything. So either put you all asleep, or I was so great I left you with nothing, left you speechless, or with absolutely no questions. So thank you for spending your time with me this morning, and we'll do the final dedication. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind. Great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved in the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized. May they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for those living in oppression, for those who are imprisoned who should be free, and for all refugees from catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, and those ministering to them, especially for those suffering from COVID-19, those working to protect and treat them, and those grieving to those lost to this pandemic. May they be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Sabbe sata sadahantu, avera sukha jivino, katang punya phalang maihang, sabbe bhagi bhavantu te. May all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May all share in the blessings that spring from the good we have done. I see somebody's posted something. Let me see what it was. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. So, three bows to the Buddha. Bows to you. Enjoy your Sunday.